estate manager at Lowther. He very kindly agreed to come. He had spent his whole life working on farms, graduated from St Andrews University, and specialised in environmental geography. He received last year the Nuffield Scholarship on looking at the future of marginal farming and the untapped benefits of rewilding. Hi, Steve. A particular interest of his is the introduction of the Eurasian beaver into Cumbria, and Lowther has been hosting this program since 2020, which no doubt he will touch on during his talk. He will focus on the transition of Lowther Estate from conventional farming to its current practices of wildland farming. I'm one of the few privileged people to have seen already his slides. I think you're in for a treat today. So he'll speak for whatever length of time he needs, then we'll have the traditional Q&A after that. We won't, on this occasion, have drinks and so on. We're trying to still get over the COVID issues, but probably we'll start that process at our AGM in March, when we'll start hosting some more convivial drinking and so on after the talk, just to allow us to change between us all. So, without any more ado, I will pass to Jim. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to talk to you all. And I said this at a talk that I recently did in Penrith. It's amazing seeing audiences like this that we've got today and hearing that we've got maybe 100 people on Zoom, because it really shows that interest is spiking in this sort of field. And maybe what we're doing is starting to have an effect on the locals. And that's what I'm here to talk to you guys about today. So as Tim said, I'm the assistant estate manager at Lowther. That means everything. For me, a title doesn't mean much. It can be everything from summer I do bees, and then in winter I'm mucking out cowsheds. So I'm very fortunate position to have a bit of an oversight in the whole running of our home farm. So you guys probably all know where we are in the room, but there maybe are some people that don't. We're in a pretty fortunate position really as an estate that we've got great transport links. So that allows us to have lots of people coming to visit us, which we all appreciate or maybe don't appreciate in the lakes at some points. What we have to realise with the estate, it's quite a large estate, it's one of the biggest in Cumbria. But what I'm going to talk about today is more of our home farm. So it's what we actually manage in hand. We do have productive dairy farms, tenanted farms outside of what I'm talking about, as well as large commons and other businesses. But what I'm focusing on today is what we purely control in-house, just below the castle at Lowther. As a bit of background, and probably what we're most recognised by is our historic castle. So that was built in 1805, or designed in 1805 by Robert Smirk, and it enjoyed about 150 years, give or take, of the family living there. During the Second World War, it was requisitioned by the army. And as you can imagine, it was handed back in a bit of a state of disrepair. There was a lot of maintenance had to be done. And the family couldn't really afford to do it. So they shuttered the building. But then 1957, and maybe some of you remember it, so maybe some of you remember the newspaper cuttings of when the castle roof was taken off, the contents was all sold. And that was a bit of a turning point in the estate. So that was when the previous Earl of Lonsdale decided to go into more conventional farming and really farm the land. So the castle was turned into what you can see here behind me, an intensive broiler unit. We had pigs in the main castle. The current owner, Jim Lowther, remembers tipping turnips in where the cafe now is in the courtyard. So it went through a period of massive change. What it also led to was it was placed in the at-risk register. So we were told by English Heritage, you either could do something about this, or we're going to maybe have to even step in. So that was when the decision was taken by Jim to actually start restoring the castle, which led to it being opened in 2012. And it's now one of the biggest tourist attractions in the lakes, with over about 110,000 visitors a year, which is great for the local area. It's bringing people in, they're going to the local stores, as well as visiting us and creating a lot of employment. But that's just a bit of a side of what we do. I focus more on the actual farm, so we'll quickly jump away. But if you do have questions on the castle, please do ask at the end. So I've changed my talk a little bit just because it's got so much in it. I used to start from 2001, but we're going to start in 2009 until today. So in 2009, we shifted from organic to conventional sheep and arable. In that sort of time, we were running between 4,500 to 5,000 sheep, and the acreage at that time was give or take 4,500 acres. If you can imagine, with the 4,500 and 1,000 replacements annually, we could be running about 10,000 sheep on the farm. So it was pretty hard. We were running a lot of sheep, but then, as you can imagine, that came to lambing time. We used to lamb inside, and at lambing time, we'd have up to 36 staff, which is a massive overhead really for an estate. You've got to imagine that we aren't a family-run farm, so everyone that comes to work that day gets paid, which is accounted for, and that's something that sets us aside from maybe other farmers, where we have to account for all of our labour, and therefore the costs start spiralling. What we didn't realise was the flock had a disease called medavisna that was endemic in the flock. So that led to poor quality of lambs being produced, and we had to make a decision. We were probably going to have to change that. We also ran arable enterprise on the same side of it. So we're running about 1,000 acres of arable, as well as the sort of 4,000 acres. And that was done on a quick 3-year rotation of winter wheat, winter barley, and oilseed rape. Pretty traditional. But you can see in the picture of the oilseed rape that there really was no space for nature. We didn't leave anything for nature. We used to plough up to the margins, right up to the fence line. You can see the lovely oak tree standing in the middle that had its roots compacted for years through ploughing and sowing rape right underneath it. But we had to think about what we were doing, because we also did everything in-house. We had our own grain store, we had our own dryers, we had our own drills, our sprayers. The only thing we actually used to contract was the combine. So then you get massive depreciation in all of our machinery as well. So in around 2019, we realized it was an unviable enterprise. We've been losing money for the past 15 years on the farm, which I always say, maybe some of you run your own businesses. If you were making a loss for 15 years, you would probably think something's not quite working here. We're going to have to make a change. So it probably was time for change. We had to think about lots of different things. It all coincided quite nicely when the owner was talking to other estates, most notably Izzy and Charlie down at Net, and they were saying, well, have you even thought about doing this? Have you even thought about looking at more of the environmental route? It coincided when we were getting more advice from our Natural England advisors of potential schemes that were coming up to offer. It also coincided with a crazy little insect called a honeybee, and we'll come on to that later on. And it's amazing the impact that a tiny little insect had on running a large home farm that we have. So this is when wilding became a thing. At the time, it was rewilding. You could call it whatever you want. Rewilding is quite a term that maybe evokes quite a lot of emotions, and I'm sure it does in this room or even on Zoom. I'm sure some of you think terrible thing, but it can mean whatever you want. For us, it means we want to bring nature back, and that is the paramount of what we do on our farm. Our main purpose is nature, and that's where our mindset started to change. But farming is also important in that you don't get nature without farming, you don't get food without nature. It's all intertwined. So for us, the terms aren't really a huge thing, but we wanted to incorporate the fact that we still were having an impact on the land for our management. So and this probably will change tomorrow, but we start to call it wildland farming. So we're trying to bring back that wild nature, but we still want to farm alongside it. And Tim mentioned my Nuffield scholarship, and that's something that I'm interested in looking at. Can these rewilded landscapes still produce? And can they actually create a more sustainable, resilient farming economy? So in 2019, we had a complete shift into what at the time was called our regenerative land management. So what does that actually mean for us? We wanted to regenerate our landscapes, so looking at a bigger scale. We were no longer just wanting to look at a couple of fields where we would sow the odd wildflower meadow and maybe plant the odd tree. We want to look at landscape scale. And maybe some of you, I know some of the people in this room have been to see it. We like to feel like we are now operating at a landscape scale of restoration, which offers massive opportunities as well. We want to look at our ecosystems. So it's again, this whole bigger picture. We're not just looking at bringing one individual back. We want to bring multiple individuals back, from whether it's a butterfly or whether it's a rare flower. We want to bring everything back into our ecosystem. More importantly, we want to look at our soils. Agriculture is famous for destroying soils if it's done incorrectly or unsustainably. Our soils aren't there forever, so we've got to look after them. So that's why we wanted to look at practices where we could actually start building up our soils again and creating healthy soils. Probably the most important, we wanted to regenerate our bottom line. We wanted to turn the tide, and we wanted to actually start bringing a profit back into our farming business. So I kind of gave you a bit of a definition to what we see as regenerative. But I think the main thing, and this is just a term that someone just came to me yesterday, the main thing is woolliness. And it's not something we expect to see in a landscape. Normally, for most people sitting in this room, and I'm included, my grandparents were included who were farmers down in Nottinghamshire, the main thing that we're used to seeing is tidiness. And now we don't agree that tidiness is the right thing we should be seeing in the landscape. Instead, a noisy landscape, a woolly landscape, is doing so much more for so many more things. And we can start to see that with what we're doing. So you can see on there, we've got things from soaking up the water to reduce flooding. Therefore, we get a different social impact to places downstream, but also then we get the positive impact for things locally for our wetland birds to also benefit from making space of water. We want to look at our grazing animals, we'll come into that. And carbon, we wanted to recarbonize our land. As a practice, we've been famous for creating carbon emissions, and that's something that farming is heavily scrutinized for as being a CO2 emitter. And when we did a survey recently, when we were doing our conventional sheep, we were emitting 4 tons of carbon per hectare per year, which doesn't seem a lot, but now we're sequestering 20 tons of carbon per hectare per year. So that's a massive turnaround just through a simple thing. And that's accounting for all the machinery that we used to run and the intensive grazing as well. So where do we sit in all this? We've got someone like Yellowstone National Park on the top left of the screen, who are probably not really producing anything, but by crikey, they've got wildlife. There's an incredible video when you watch wolves return to Yellowstone and you see the knock-on effects that all brings. And that really highlights what you can do in a natural environment. And then you've got someone like Gabe Brown, Dirt to Soil, who's in North America producing a no-till arable farmland, but still farming it really hard and conventionally, but it is managing to restore his soils through a no-tillage method. So we sit somewhere on that top left. We'd like to see that we're restoring the environment. We're maybe trying to produce a little bit more than somewhere like Netcastle with down in the south, but we are moving away from that more output degenerative agricultural system. So I already mentioned that we sold the sheep, but we had to force the change. And how do you force the change? You can sell sheep and buy sheep again. But the biggest decision for us was our dispersal sale. And when we talked to a few people about how do you make this change, it's quite a big leap. Let's go from sheep to wilding. How do we make that? And they said, there's one thing that you've got to do. You've got to sell everything. So we thought about that. So you sell everything, right? And why do we do that? Well, you can't go back. So you sell everything. It's a massive capital outlay if you have to go back. So in November 2019, 2 weeks after the final sheep left the farm, we sold everything. We sold all the tractors, the plows, the sheep feeders, even the yard brushes. We do sometimes regret selling the yard brushes, but we did. And it was quite an emotional day because it was that time of change for us. But it really did force us to change our mindset as well. So starting in end of 2019, start of 2020, we changed our grazes into a more cattle-based system. Our end goal was to have a pure English longhorn herd, but we couldn't jump completely into that. You can't go out and buy 100 females just like that. So we started off, and this was actually quite an interesting thing for us. So we started off with Angus's and Longhorns. And the first winter really brought it home of why we wanted the English Longhorn back into the estate. It was Christmas 2020, and all the cows were outside. It happened to be on Christmas Day, and we had to bring the Anguses in. It got to the stage where their welfare was coming into the question, that they couldn't just sustain themselves outside, even though we were feeding them. So as soon as we bring them in, we had to bed them up. That was £800 a week of straw. We had to put our labour into it. We had to put our machinery into it. And we had to feed them. We had to buy concentrates. So then we have to import soya in our concentrates, chop down the rainforest in the Amazon to create the soya. So suddenly it's quite a different thing. Our Longhorns on the other side, they got 3 bales of hay that winter. And that was it. And suddenly it really did bring home why we had to change to this more native. Aberdeen Anguses are a native species, but perhaps something like the Longhorn, a bit more of a hardy cow, could actually tolerate these hard, long winters. And there are many other species that also do it. But for us, we wanted to go down the Longhorn route. So we eventually phased out the Anguses and we went into a pure Longhorn herd, which is now 120 females plus their followers, which to me is a pretty big farm. Okay, it's across maybe 6,000 acres now, but it's still a lot of cattle on a farm. So we're now the sixth biggest Longhorn herd in the UK, with our aspirations of being number one in 2 years' time. So in 2 years' time, I would hope that number will be 200 females plus all their followers. So at that stage, we could be running about 500 cattle on our farm, which is again a serious thing for us to undertake. And what does that involve? It involves quite a lot of labour. But we're trying to manage our stock differently now. So we keep all of our heifers, we fatten our bullocks, and we're trying to look for the best trade of meat off them. But how do we actually manage our cattle? So when we started this process, we had 152 fields on that 5,000 acres, if you like. Now we've got 5. And those fields can range anywhere from, I think our smallest is 400 acres, and our biggest is 850. And it's 4 kilometers length to length. So what does that allow us to do? It allows the cattle to behave more naturally. They can actually function as a natural herd. They develop matriarchal instincts. You get these amazing little calf pressures that they're just dumped with one poor cow for the day, and the cows cause chaos. But it develops these amazing things that you see. You see the trods that they develop, and they make these incredible circles of massive walkways that they just take. And you see them all lining up and walking for miles, and they cover huge distances. But then that brings problems. Suddenly, when we're calving outside in an 800-acre block with 100 females, we can spend the whole day looking for one cow. And it's quite a managed task because we still have to bring our welfare into it. We want to farm these animals. We can't just forget about them and just let them disappear into the landscape. We want to still manage them. So this is when technology is really coming to help farmers, I believe, especially in our situation. So we went into a system called no fence collars recently. We tried it on 12 cows on the fell. As you all know, the fells have got no fences, so we had to work it out. We couldn't really just put the cows up there and just forget them because they could disappear off the wind of it. So we tried 12 collars on the fell in a certain area, and it worked amazingly well. So now we've put collars on every cow. So that's 110 collars on our farm. And you can see here how it works. So the picture's not the best, but on the top left is a picture of some of our cows with the no fence collars on. It's kind of like one you see in the Alps with a big cowbell, except it doesn't make a nice little bell sound. And you can see on the second picture in from the left, the heat map. So that's their positions. Actually, it was 2 days ago, so not yesterday, 2 days ago. And you can see where they focus most in that grazing period. And the bit which isn't red, it's to the west, or the east actually, sorry, is excluded. So that is a virtual electric fence that we've just put on our phones and we've just mapped it out. We've excluded that bit because we're not allowed to graze it through an old environmental scheme. And then you can see on the middle one, that's the electric pulses. So that's exactly the same as a normal electric fence. So the cows approach it, they get a sound as they come closer to the fence. And when they actually cross or get on the line, they get a normal electric fence pulse. No different to an ordinary strand of electric wire. But then you can see, as they've learned, they don't escape. And that I haven't made that far right picture up. There were no escapes 2 days ago. And we haven't had any, so the collars have been on for 2 weeks now on all the females. For the past 4 days, we've had no escapes. So that's the sort of learning time it takes. And it's amazing to see how that helps us manage the cows. Suddenly, we can see exactly where they are. So we're not wasting time driving around 800 acres trying to find 60 cows in this case. We know exactly where they are because we've just looked on our phones and it says they're over in the top corner. So we can go straight there and look on them. Also, if they're inactive for over an hour, we get an alert. So suddenly when maybe something's calving and it's having difficulty for an hour, we get an exact location of where it is, which is going to really help us start to manage our cows a bit differently. But also, there is some management problems by taking out 70 kilometers of fencing. Suddenly we can't control where the cows go. And cows are like us. Imagine you've got, maybe not for everyone, but a candy store, and then you've got some vegetables. Most kids would go to the candy store and just eat there all day. And it's the same for the cows. There's certain fields where they just love to graze. And then at the minute, or before the collars, we couldn't push them away from that because we've just got an 800-acre field. And we don't want to employ someone all day just to keep moving the cows off this one field. So we suddenly ended up with one very intensely grazed field and the rest was allowed to grow up. So now we can use the collars to actually start moving the cows off these areas to give them a break inside our larger compartments. which starts to create that mosaic habitat. So hopefully, and this is a photo that we're now starting to see, this is actually from Net Castle. But these are the sort of environments we're seeing. We're seeing cows grazing under big ancient parkland trees with a lot of vegetation coming up around them, from thistles and nettles. People used to hate thistles and nettles. My grandfather couldn't even bear coming to the estate because he just couldn't believe that we weren't mowing thistles. But it's once you change your mindset, so what is a thistle? Why is it so bad? It's great for pollinators, the seeds are great for birds in the autumn and the winter. Suddenly from one thistle, you get a lot of things coming back. Our moth counts went up 40% in 2 years just because we stopped mowing thistles. It's quite an interesting thing just to look at the benefits that one plant can do. The deadwood is another environment that we've now started to gain back. Any tree that falls over that isn't dangerous to the public, we leave. Doesn't get harvested for firewood or timber. We just leave it for deadwood. And it's now a new environment. We get our amphibians, our invertebrates that come back, which then benefit all the knock-on effects into our bird species. We've also got pigs. If anyone wants a Tamworth pig, you can have a Tamworth pig. These are amazing things, but they need to be treated with caution. For us, we have 6 pigs across 6,000 acres. So that's a pig per 1,000 acre. And that is enough for us in our scenario. But we like to use our pigs as a tool. So why do we have them? We don't have them for a meat industry. We don't breed from them. We don't do anything anymore with them. But we have them for a specific reason. What they're here for is to turn the ground over. As you've seen in most of the photos, we're very dominated by improved grassland. And what that is, that grass is so competitive, it outcompetes everything. So it's great because it develops this armor of our soils to stop runoff. But then suddenly it becomes detrimental to us because nothing can break through that armor to actually regenerate. So all the seeds that come out through birds, or whether they've been windblown off trees, can't actually reach the bare soil because our armor is too strong. So then suddenly the pig comes along, turns that over, creates bare soil, the seed can drop in. But they can do that quite a lot. So in winter, our pigs are probably capable of doing an acre a day if they're really feeling up for it and they got to a nice wet spot. So we have to manage them. So in winter, we now move them to the woods. And you may think, why just move them to the woods? Well, there's a few reasons. Firstly is shelter. There's a lot more shelter in the woods for them. But secondly, it helps with our woodland management. So productive timber comes out of that. So suddenly if we can put them in the woods, where we've just done a thinning process, and now the light's coming onto the forest floor, we can actually allow the pigs to help with that regeneration of woodland in it. In the past, we would have probably thinned and then we would restock with trees, whereas now we put the pigs in, and then we leave it for 5 years, and we'll start to see regeneration coming up through it. And then we can use that timber to start harvesting from in years to come. We also have bees. So I mentioned bees transitioned why we went into this wildland farming. And you may think, how did that happen? Well, at the time, in sort of 2019, 2018, Jim Lowther had 200 beehives. And at that time, when he reached 200, he couldn't actually sustain them on his home farm of that 4,500, 5,000 acres. The bees actually couldn't survive through the year. There wasn't enough food for them. There wasn't enough forage. So if you cast your minds back a few slides, that oilseed rape field, that's all they had. Once the flowers are gone, they're gone. There's nothing that comes after an oilseed rape field. So it opened his mindset to there's something depleted in the landscape. He had to restore the landscape, not just for the bees, but for the other pollinators and nature. So now the two of us, the two Jims, Big Jim and Little Jim, we run 500 beehives and we produce 3 types of honey that we sell locally. And we're making around 14 tons a year of honey that we do all ourselves. Just about there's 3 of us now that do the business. So we do all the labor, all the packaging, all the extraction and all the beekeeping. But I never thought I would get into bees. I truly never thought I'd do beekeeping. What it does do, it opens your eyes to the environment. Now when we go and work with the bees, you're looking around and you've got to work out what they're harvesting, what they're foraging on, and you suddenly look at a landscape in a different way. You're looking at a landscape for flowers. What's actually flowering at that time of year? What's going to be beneficial for the bees? Have they got water? It's all these little things that are coming into us. So now we want to use our bees a little bit. So how do I use the bees? Well, for a start off, we look at how our bees have benefited from the change in the environment. So we've had a site at that oilseed rape field for the past 8 years. And when it was an oilseed rape field in traditional agriculture, they were producing an average of 8 kilos of honey per hive per year. Now that field is a wildflower meadow. And last year they produced 42 kilos per honey per hive per year. The bees didn't change. Maybe there were some new worker bees, but the genetics were all the same type of hive. The only thing that changed was the environment. And it was that direct change. We also start to monitor all of our honey. So we do pollen analysis to actually see what's inside the honey so we can start to see what flowers are actually benefiting the pollinators enough. And maybe some of you in the room are saying, well, that's great, you can have all these beehives. But what about the native pollinators? Are they not outcompeting the native pollinators? So we do surveys every year. We do every season, 4 surveys a year to look at our pollinators in the summer and see how they're doing. And what we're starting to see is they're actually benefiting as well. So it's our belief that if we can keep our bee numbers to a sustainable level, which you've probably reached now, then the pollinators can also sustain themselves and benefit as well. So we've got to be very cautious of that. We don't want to start flooding the air with too many bees because then the natural pollinators won't be able to flourish as well. So we're very cautious that we need to keep our population of bees in the area at the right time. Trees. So as part of our restoration in 2019, we did a 1,000-acre woodland. So at that time, it was the biggest ever woodland done in the UK. But it also gave us an opportunity not just to sell timber. So at that time, it was when carbon was coming into it. So we actually traded all the carbon, the 100,000 tons of carbon off that woodland. And what did that allow us to do? Well, it's a diversification of income. I was talking to someone earlier today about it. In the past, we used to rely on one income stream, and that was land. Now we've got about 5 or 6, and carbon's one of those. So suddenly, if one of those income streams drops off a cliff, which quite often things do this day and age, we've got another 5 or 4 things that can actually support our business. And one of those is carbon. But it's not just intensive trees. So we were very fortunate to get help by Rewilding Britain last year to do a tree seed experiment. One of the biggest complaints that we have on the estate is the amount of plastic that we put into the landscape. And I can't argue with that. We have put an awful lot of plastic into the estate through protection of trees with tubes. And it's something we can't avoid currently. There are people trying to make new methods, but not at scale yet. So we wanted to look at an experiment to establish woodland cover, but with no capital, just doing it how trees would naturally do, just reseeding. So we had 4 different areas covering about 10 acres in total, with different mixes, from wetland mixes to more woodland edge mixes, and also and more upland sort of scrub mixes. And we wanted to establish them in different ways, use our pigs in one area to rotivate it, and then we flatten the ground, otherwise we were bouncing around on the little tractor trying to actually get the seed in. We used a plough to certain bits that you see on the bottom left, and then we actually undersowed oats into that field and the seed underneath it. So then the oats actually acted as a nursery crop for our trees. So suddenly the protection wasn't through plastic, but it was through oats instead. And then we've seen now the birds have actually benefited because we did it as an unharvested cereal. So we've got the birds that came in for the oats and our seeds, and our oaks are still flowering underneath it. So we're actually getting a massive rejuvenation of our seeds through that. But it's not just trees, it's wildflowers. This photo is that old seed rate field for comparison. So that's the 8 to 42 kilos. So we've done about 220 acres of wildflower meadow restorations now, and we're doing more and more every year. So next year we're doing another 50 acres of upland hay meadow restoration, and we'll talk about how we're starting to do that in the next slide. But this is an environment that we're not often seeing, and this meadow perhaps isn't the most traditional of meadows. We call this our bling meadow, and probably to the purists, this isn't right. But what it did do is it sparked conversation locally. Suddenly, we had people flock to the area to see it. We had people running through like Theresa May did in her bad days and taking pictures inside the meadow. And it reconnected people with nature. And that is so important because it's something that we really are losing, is that connection with nature. And just a simple wildflower meadow did that for us, which is quite nice to see. Now, how do we do this? There's loads of different established methods that you can do to get a wildflower meadow back. They're all expensive. There's no hiding behind that. So this one, we got help with the Woodland Trust. We sowed it, we deep plowed it to a meter's depth, which reduced the fertility. So we basically took all the topsoil and flipped it down to the bottom. The only problem was we've got quite a rocky land, so we snapped the plow in half twice. So we only did half the field. But then that led to an amazing experiment. Suddenly we had the central belt of the field that was like a desert. It was completely unfertile, completely dry soil that was flourished with wildflowers. And the edges did too, but the weeds and the grasses could come back quite quickly. So then suddenly the wildflowers are starting to be outcompeted by docks and other species. So we start to see that different comparison coming through. But wildflowers are pretty expensive to buy. And I'm sure maybe some of you have done it in your own garden or maybe on a bigger scale. Buying a box of wildflower seed is not cheap. So when you try and do it across a couple of 100 acres, you suddenly have to think, well, actually, we need to think of an artillery method. And this is when our employment started to change. So if you came back in 2019, we just had shepherds. That's all we had. Whereas now we've got 10 full-time people on the farm, and 7 of those are under the age of 30. And one of them is our second most recent employee, was trained at Kew Gardens and is an expert in horticulture. And I guarantee he would never have come to work for us in 2019, and we would never have employed him. And it's just how our land management has changed, that we're now starting to actually diversify our employment as well as increase it, which I think is quite rewarding. So what does this chap called Joe bring to our team? Well, he brings his horticulture knowledge and his passion to actually start restoring the environment. And he said, if we're going to do this upland hay meadow restoration, we should really just grow our seeds ourselves. It's not that hard. Everyone does it. So I have no knowledge in horticulture. So Joe runs this as his own project. And he described panda plants. And that's what quite a lot of our upland hay meadow plants are. A panda plant, you may think, what's a panda plant? This is the only way I can understand it. Pandas are very hard at breeding. They're very fickle, and they only breed a couple of times, if you're lucky. And that's effectively what something like the Woods Cranesville is. It's an incredible hard plant to establish and get it to germinate and keep going. So now we're actually managing to grow these in our nursery that you can see behind in these pictures, and start to develop into plug plants or maybe even into potted plants that then we can actually put out into our landscape and give them a better chance instead of just putting the seed into the soil. And we still do seeds, but we have different established methods every year. We also do our trees. So we grow our own trees, not to a big enough scale that we can do all self-grown trees on the estate, but we do some each year for different species. So you may remember a few years ago, the locals in the room, that we had massive nets in front of the castle for about a couple of months in the autumn. We were collecting acorns, and we collected about 4 tons that year, and they were sent off, and we got our royalty back, which was 10%. So we got 400 kilos of acorns, which I can tell you is an awful lot of acorns. So now we started potting them and growing them on. So now we've got about 400 acorn oak trees to now put out this year, which is a great thing to put that back into our own landscape. So I talked about water at the start, how we wanted to regenerate our water and look after our waterways. And that's something that we're really cautious of. If you looked at most of the rivers in the UK, they're all straight. And that's all they do. They've just been canalised and they run straight, which is great. It gets the water off the land and fast downstream, floods a few places on the way, and it goes into the sea. But we wanted to think, well, actually, that isn't how it happened. Naturally, a river is much more functional than that. It twists, it winds, it floods over its banks, creates wetlands either side, and everything flourishes from it. So we did a big project working with Reading Rivers Trust to restore our wetlands, as well as creating attenuation ponds that you see at pond bottom here on the bottom right, to mitigate these high rainfall events, to try and help with the problems downstream. This is just a quick picture of maybe what we would hope to see pond bottom looking like in a few years' time. So that's the pond to the bottom right. That's the sort of environment that we envisage our estate coming into. But when we started our river restoration, this is the landscape that we were looking at. So pretty much just a very improved grassland with not much else going on, apart from a tiny pocket at the northern edge, which is a bit of a swampy, flushy area, but not much environment going on around it. This is what we wanted to get to. We wanted to push that improved grassland back by creating rapids, by putting cut channels into our floodplain, pushing the water out of the river channel into its naturally functioning floodplain. So now once we've done that, we hold the water about 12 hours compared to in the past we would hold it for about 4 or 6. So when there's a big rainfall event, which is for us is over 80 million a day, that's when we say we've had a lot of rain. Once that happens, we can hold that water for that long. And it's amazing to see it, because suddenly all the downstream impacts, and I'm not talking it's going to save on a Storm Desmond event, but locally it can help if we did this on a bigger scale. And there are lots of other projects doing this. So these are the sort of views that we are thinking we're going to start to see in years to come. And this is that woolly, noisy effect that I talked about at the start. And you may think, well, you can't climb in that. But suddenly our longhorns can. Our longhorns can graze amongst that, but also what can else go along there? All the insects and the birds and the mammals can actually start to flourish and work as a natural ecosystem. Our wildflower meadow at Wandles might actually start to deteriorate, but we don't mind that. Suddenly, the natural balance of the ecosystem will come right, and we'll start to see a woody scrubland edge with a grass meadow in the middle. And that's fine for our ecosystem. We also do things a bit differently. So what I've talked about so far isn't that dissimilar to what any farm could do. They could have cattle, they could have bees, they could do a few wildflowers and a few trees. But we wanted to go one step further. We wanted to think what was here, but is now no longer here, or in this case, not anymore. So we talked to a lot of experts about what species could be here. And the most well-known keystone species in the UK that we can bring back is a Eurasian beaver. We would love to think that we could bring any keystone species back, but we're not going to bring back the wolf. But the beaver is something that we can do that can have serious change to the environment. So our pen is an enclosure. We've got a 5-year license to do a 26-acre enclosure. And you can see it marked here on the red. And that's a full enclosed area with gates at the bottom to stop the beaver coming in and out of the stream. And the stream is only on the woodland, which hopefully my mouse will show. Oh, not on here, I'm afraid. But where the blue circle is, on that edge of the woodland, is a tiny little stream, which was no more than a metre wide at any point and no more than 20 centimetres deep. And that was it. That was what they were put into. We had to do a small wetland scrape just to put them into when we release them. And the reason for that is beaver security comes in depth of water. So we couldn't just release them into the pen with only 20 centimetres because they would just feel insecure and not safe. So that's why we did the wetland scrape, and we had an artificial lodge as well. But why do we do this? Why do we want beavers back in the landscape? Well, it's what they do. For some of you, you may think that isn't right, but their dam building, their engineering creates so much habitat. It's so beneficial, not just for us, but for many other things. So I put this slide in when I first did a presentation saying, is this what we expect to see in 2022? Well, 2022 has been and gone. And I'm pleased to say this is the sort of thing we're starting to see. So this was the environment when we first put them in. You can see that it's a very woody scrubland edge, but you can see on the left-hand picture that it's a very small gravelly bed stream, not much to it, and hardly any functionality. So when we did the initial surveys, when we put the beavers in to look at what was in the river system, we found no fish, no invertebrates on the edges, no wildlife, which is quite a stark thing for us to look at. You may think that's a lovely little stream, but what's actually happening inside of it? That's what you got to think about. So what are the impacts that beavers could have? Well, you probably all know that they dam, they fell trees, and that's the chaos they create. For some of you, you may think that's terrible. That's absolutely a terrible thing to do to your landscape. Why would you want all your trees felled? Why would you want dams in your river network? Well, for us, it actually started to build resilience. And you may think that's really strange. How does a beaver damming woods and streams build resilience to your farming enterprise? Well, in last summer, when we had the big drought, and albeit Cumbria didn't really get hit by the drought, we're incredibly lucky that we are where we are. But our grass in this enclosure never stopped growing. And that's what really was brought it home for me. On the rest of the estate, the grass actually stopped growing for the cattle. They were okay, but the grass did stop in that high period of drought. Whereas the beaver pen, because of the moisture that the beavers brought in through their dam building, allowed the grass to stay green and lush. So we could actually still graze our longhorns in there. So you could almost fatten your cows on the beaver pen, which is quite a weird thing to see. But more importantly, the impacts that the beavers were having through their dams was amazing. So in the 3 years they've been here, we've seen our teal numbers go up by 200%. We've seen our snipe numbers go up by 300%. And we're starting to see lapwings come back into breeding in the pen. We're starting to see a curlew, one pair of curlews actually came back. And where are they actually going? They're going into the wetland that the beavers have created. They're using that as a sanctuary because everything else around them, for them, is not suitable habitat anymore. Something like a curlew, if we don't start helping now, is going to be gone. And that's quite a sad state to be in the generation where we lose the curlew. There's quite a charismatic species of the whole of the UK. It's not just up here. But the beavers also help us. And you may think, how the hell does a beaver help us? Well, when they spread the water, it helps with our water quality. Suddenly, the dams that they're no longer working on fill up with silt. So we're starting to capture so much silt in these ponds. If you can imagine, the dam is quite a steep-sided thing when they start building it. But by a couple of months' time, it's this really shallow gradient that's just captured all the silt as it comes through. It's like a coffee filter. It's just the same thing. But they're also slowing the flow. And I noticed it for the first time this year. And I've read books and I've listened to people talk about beavers, but I've never seen it in person until this year. When we had the really high rainfall at the start of the year, and the river came up and it topped its banks and it was quite erratic, the beaver pen didn't change one bit. And that's what's really strange. And I don't know how they do it, but it doesn't change at any point during the year. The water level just stays the same. It doesn't matter how much water comes in or how much water goes out, it just stays the same. They've got this amazing ability to really mitigate these peaks and troughs in the rainfall. And that's because that's where the security comes from. They need the water to access the food. And that's why they start building canals into the woodlands that you see on the top right and the top left. But that brings so much benefit to us. I haven't even mentioned biodiversity, because I feel that's just a common thing that we should all realize that they do. But this first thing that happened in the beaver pen, when you say what's the first impact you saw? Well, it was our amphibians. Suddenly, we actually started to keep our amphibians. In 2019, we had a 90% loss of frog spawn on the estate, because we had a high rainfall, all the spawn came, and then we had a high period of no rain, long period of no rain, sorry. And all the spawn dried out and died. But suddenly when the beavers came, in the next photo on, or maybe in 2 photos time, we had frog spawn in the middle of a field. It was bizarre to see. And then we had tadpoles swimming around in the grasses. And it was amazing because then this bird started coming in and the herons returned to Setra. And it was incredible to see this knock-on effect just through one leaky dam. And then the most amazing thing for me this year was seeing a kingfisher on camera. And what does a kingfisher eat? A kingfisher eats fish. And that was the first, and it was a pure luck that it captured on the wildlife camera, because they sometimes can't even see the beavers on the camera. We got an amazing picture of a kingfisher flying through. And the only logic for me is that there's now fish in the ponds. So there's now actually feeding ground for things like kingfisher. So we're starting to do our surveys with the Environment Agency in the ponds to see what other life is in them. So this is the sort of thing that you're starting to see. On the bottom left photo, you can't really see it. It's not the best of qualities, but we're now pushing the water out of the river channel into our improved grassland. And it's reconnecting with these, what we call paleo channels, these ancient channels that were once there, but are now historically have been straightened and ignored to get the water off the land. But we're trying to reconnect them. And the beavers are helping us do that by pushing the water into them. And here you can see on the right-hand side, this is my photo of 2022. So these are the sort of dams we're starting to see. And you can see the size of the sticks, but there's no logic to how they build these dams. I used to build dams all the time as a kid, and they were never as good as what these guys can do. And it sums it up. When we build leaky dams as a community in stream on river networks, they work, but not to the scale of what these animals can do. And the best thing about them, if they fail, they just rebuild them for free. It doesn't cost us a thing. It's a win-win. So how does that really fit? So the beavers only have 26 acres, but we're a 6,000 acre estate or in-house farm. How do the beavers actually fit into what we do? We've got to help as much as we can. So we have blocked our drains. We're trying to lift. If you can imagine, for centuries, all we've done as a community is put our drains underground. But now we want to bring all those drains above ground, bring all that water up and put it back on the landscape. And suddenly we get areas like this that you see. And this exploded this year with teal. I've never seen so many teal on this estate as I have done here. And it is amazing to see there's birds flying through, the snipe calling, and it's just seeing that wildlife return, just given that chance. But the main thing is disturbance. We try and reduce the disturbance of these areas as much as possible. So something like the floodplain here, you see, we only graze for 3 weeks of the year. And that's what we do. Cattle only go there for 3 weeks, just to reduce that disturbance. We hardly touch it, but suddenly it becomes a refuge for all of our wildfowl. And we're in a very fortunate position that we can do that because we've got the scale to be able to ignore land. And I appreciate that's not something everybody can do. But if we could do it in certain patches, if we can, and the UK has got areas where we could do this. If we can do it, we can see nature return. We can see these species that are on the brink come back. So this is the sort of view that I'd expect to see this year. Our crazy camel pig walking across a beaver stream with the longhorns following it. And for me, this picture from there sums up that you can rewild, but you can still farm, which I think is the important thing that I'm trying to portray in this talk, that we want nature, but we want to also farm it. And the farming that we're doing may not be what you see as farming, but we're still producing. But arguably what we're producing is nature, which I think is a quite important thing in this day and age. So my final slide is looking to the future. And this is kind of where my job's going in this day and age. There are a lot of species that are on brink and really starting to suffer. And these 6 animals that you see on the slide are just a few of them. But they're all something that we're targeting. And we've all got to work together, whether it's a grey partridge that we'll try and release this year, whether it's the white storks that will hopefully breed in a few years' time, or whether it's a pine martin that's starting to return from Scotland to come down into our woodland, or maybe it's a little water vole that we're doing. And that's a massive achievement from the catchment. The whole of our catchment is catching mink, invasive American mink, to try and then reintroduce water vole back into the catchment, which would be amazing to see as a prey source for other predators going forwards. And then something like the redback shrike would be amazing to see back into our scrublands. A bird that was last seen here in 1970 would be something that would be a really high point for the estate if we can achieve getting a little bird like that. And maybe something that's just become a bit more topical is making our rivers more wild, getting something like the Lowther sturgeon that you see in the background there, bringing that back into our waterways. But the only way these animals can come back is if the environment really starts to function. All these animals that you see can only work in that woolly environment, whether it's a grey partridge with a traditionally managed farm with margins down their fields, unharvested stubbles, unharvested cereals, or whether it's a white stork that likes to breed and feed in grasslands and actually walk through grasslands and get the insects coming up through the hay meadows. Or maybe it's a water vole that needs a functioning riparian environment with not been dredged and cleared, instead having functional ecosystems along the riparian strip with many different wetland plants. There's about 200 plants that water voles feed on. Or maybe it's something like the shrike that needs insects, but also needs thorny scrubs to actually pierce the insects on as a food cache. And that's something that we lack in the environment. Or maybe it's something like the sturgeon that needs that water quality in our rivers. So all these animals are here asking to come back, but the environment's not quite there. But we can do that if we put the work in. And I think that'll be the success if we start to see something like a stork flying overhead, over maybe even on the cameras that Tim and Anne talked about at the start. So I hope I haven't talked on too long. I sometimes am quite guilty of just rambling on. But please, if you've got any questions, just ask. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim. I think you've totally captivated the audience. I mean, every now and again, I was looking around. Sometimes you see the odd person dropping off, and not a single person. You've had people riveted. One of the most optimistic and encouraging and inspiring talks we've had, and we've had a lot of talk. It's great to see you playing such an important role as well, and so much which is good. I mean, you didn't talk about the bottom line. I was wondering whether at the end you're going to say, yeah, we're making a lot of money as well, which is maybe you'll come to that in question. Can I open the floor to the questions? Who's going to do the first? I've got 3 here, there, and there.
It's all lovely what you just said, but is there a benefit to the public?
Can I just stop a second? So we have Zoomers. So what I'm going to ask him to do, if he can, is to repeat the question so that our Zoomers will hear. So,
Yeah, so the question to you, Zoomers, was, is there a benefit to the public? And I think that's quite an interesting question, because what we've seen in COVID So I'm going to answer it in a couple of ways. So in the first thing was access. So in COVID, what did we really want to do? And what did everyone struggle with? It was getting outside. It was a horrible time for the whole of the country. But suddenly we opened up the North Park and we allowed access into that bit. What we are very cautious of is we don't allow any public access to the rest of the home farm, purely for the reason that public and nature, unless nature's flourishing, don't go together. They just can't deal with the disturbance. But the benefit to the public of what we're doing is the public goods. And that's where it starts to get quite interesting. Public fund agriculture. There's no farmer that can deny that. What funds agriculture? And it's the public money, it's taxpayers' money. But what do we used to do with that? Well, I talked about what we used to do. We used to farm sheep. And that's all you got. Whereas now, suddenly what we're doing is delivering public goods. So what are the public goods? They're the carbon from our trees, from our soil organic matter building up. They're restoring our waterways. So suddenly we're reducing our flooding. And more importantly, it's the enjoyment that I talked about from suddenly restoring environments. So the public are getting the enjoyment out of seeing nature. Suddenly we're getting people coming to birdwatch again on the estate. They were coming to photography in the wildflower meadows. And that, I think, is more important than actually giving public access. It's actually giving public enjoyment. And I think that's something we'll do more and more as species come back. I hope that answers the question in some ways.
In the middle,
So, yes, thank you. Didn't need any form of deer control?
Yeah, so the question again was, do we need any form of deer control? And the answer is yes. For what we're doing, we're in a marathon. This is what I always say. At the minute, we're in a marathon. But in these first few years, we're in that terrible sprint start that everyone does. So we are trying to sprint as hard as possible. And that means putting an awful lot of infrastructure and trees back into the landscape. But what can't young trees survive with? And unfortunately, that's deer. So we do heavy deer management on the estate. And that's something now we're looking at more locally. Can we actually use that product, which is wild venison, and arguably the most healthy product, sustainable product you could ever eat from the countryside? It's something that's grown naturally, nothing put into it, and is sustainably killed. So can we actually start marketing that wild venison back locally into the food and get people actually starting to eat it as an everyday meat? And that's something I'd really like to achieve, but it's something that we've got to work. Not just, venison doesn't just stay in a 5,000 acre field. Deer goes everywhere, wherever it wants, whether it's the high top of Shapfell or down to the River Lowther, it will go in between. So therefore we've got to incorporate whole of the catchment. And that has to be involved in a group-led thing. But that is something that we are trying to strive for locally, to create a product, and maybe it even goes as far as being a product designation of origin. So we actually start marketing it. It could be the Oswalder catchment venison. And it's a simple thing like that that suddenly gives us value added to our venison.
from the back.
Yeah.
The question was, are you
Sorry, yeah.
volunteers?
The question was volunteers. Are we doing volunteering? In the past, we never did it. Because what volunteer would really want to come, maybe some would, for work experience, to come work on a sheep farm. But there isn't much for a volunteer to do at that stage, because it's in quite a lot of ways, it's a very skilled job. So, but what we have just started doing is weekly volunteering. So we now have minimum 4 people coming every Tuesday. And so if you do want to volunteer, just drop me an email and we'll try and fit you in. And then we also have groups that come. So we have local school groups that come to do pond dipping, to do bird box making and other activities to get the kids out of the classroom. The one thing I haven't managed to do is get them beekeeping, but they have come to see the bees. But it is something that I think really gives people a lot of enjoyment coming to do that volunteering aspect. And now we're looking at it on the estate point of view, that maybe we should all be looking at volunteering. Maybe our staff should be going out volunteering and helping in different areas as well. So yeah, long and short of it is yes, we are doing volunteering.
So I'll take a question from Miles and then I'll move on to the Zulus.
Right, thank you. You talked about regenerating the landscapes. So how can you justify rewilding the North Park in front of the castle, which is a man-made grade 2 listed park? How can you justify that?
It depends what you incorporate as rewilding. And I think that's what my first point tried to bring to the floor. Was rewilding to maybe yourself means complete forgottenness and overgrown and messy. But for us, rewilding just means nature. And that's what's quite interesting. Suddenly, we start to see nature back in the North Park. And it maybe it's just long grass. That could all be rewilding. It's just long grass allowing regrowth. And it doesn't have to be this impenetrable thicket that you can't imagine. It's all rewilding is to me, is giving space. And I think that's all I would justify it as. It's giving space to nature. It's not declassifying a parkland. It's just giving nature that bit more space. So we're no longer mowing it to an inch of its life with sheep. Suddenly we actually start seeing butterflies and birds going back into it. And I think that's probably more beneficial to a parkland than no nature at all.
So you don't think you've affected its grade 2 listed status as a natural park?
No, I honestly don't. And all the feelings that we get from the national park and the planning authorities and everyone, they're all on side with what we're doing. They see it as a massive benefit, not just to the community, but to the park. Whether it's the national park, whether it's our grade 2 listed park. I don't think if you walk through it, there's any detrimental impact that's happened to it.
Gordon, could you, we have 2 or 3 questions from Zoom.
We have a question from Lucy. See, I'm tickling. We have a question from Lucy who asks, "What is your view on the raising of game birds on Lowther land?"
Yeah. So the question to the whole group was, what's our opinion on raising game birds on Lowther land? And that's quite an interesting one, really. So this is the whole shooting debate. Is shooting right or wrong? So we have different cores on our estate. So we have our core 1, which is what I've talked about here today. So that's our rewilding, wildland farming, regenerative farming hub, where we're really focused on bringing nature back. And as we zone out, we get into our more regenerative land. So then we get into our in-hand dairy farm, where we're trying to farm that regeneratively, looking at our margins, our more herbal layers that are coming through, using different cattle. And then as we move out again, we get onto our more productive land. So our conventionally farmed land and our conventionally forested areas for commercial timber. And something that coincides with that is game shooting. And I think we've all got to realize the benefit of all systems. And something that game shooting is, whether you love it or hate it, is it's been here for quite a long time. It supports a lot of local economies. And it's something that we can't just push away. It's maybe something that has to change, but you can't just suddenly sacrifice it, because what you're sacrificing there is a local economy and local people. But what probably does have to change is how it's done. Maybe the numbers that are put down, maybe the sustainability of the shoot, how the shoot's operated. And that's something we are looking into, reducing numbers and changing how we manage our game shoots. I hope that answered the question for the Zoomer.
Is there another Zoom question? Okay, I'll reopen the floor here. Oh, 1, 2, 3 questions. Who's the first? Oh, yes, thank you.
Yeah, just wondered where the longhorn steers or bullocks go, or fattening.
Yeah, so the question was, where do our longhorn steers go? We fatten all of them ourselves. We don't push them. So sometimes they go over 30 months, sometimes they don't, just depends on what happens. What we have realized is they're a seasonal product. So when I say that, when we talked to our abattoir, they said, look, in December, they're useless because we're not feeding them. So their condition drops off them. So suddenly they've got no fat cover and they're not really fit to slaughter. So then maybe we have to look at our beef as a seasonal product, which for us is fine. But I think what is a bit more interesting and something that really hit us home this year, and this again comes into how we have to manage ourselves being an estate, not a family-owned farm, is we tried to market our beef in boxes and just sell it locally, because I think that's a lovely thing to do. That would be my dream if I could sell all of our beef in a box. I'll be lying to you if I said we did. Unfortunately, when we did it, we still made money and a good profit from it, but we only made £200 more than just selling it into the market. And that wasn't including all of our time and the cost of taking the animal there and back. So it's quite a stark thing. Suddenly it kind of opens this thing in your mind. Well, maybe the bigger issue isn't how the animal's slaughtered, but it's also people have got to be willing to pay for it. Suddenly what we're doing, and there's a lot of local farmers, some are even in this room, that are doing amazing things with their beef or sheep, but people aren't willing to pay for that, what they're actually doing. They're doing incredible restoration work with their cattle or their sheep, but people wouldn't be willing to actually pay the price that is probably needed to make it a viable business for them. And I think that's maybe the sad state that we're in. we're all guilty of it, going to a supermarket and probably looking at the price of meat. But something that if you want it to be locally grown and restoring a landscape, well, then you've got to be willing to probably go into your pocket a bit deeper. But at the minute, I don't think we're quite there. But again, it's a marketing thing. Maybe we didn't really push the marketing. You could easily market it. I'm sure there's people down south that will pay an awful lot if you spun the story a little bit more.
Yes, thank you.
You mentioned the beaver on the license for a period of time. Where do you see that going in the future? You ever see a time when there aren't going to be offensive?
I would love to pass this to someone sitting in the room. I won't. I have no idea. Oh, sorry. Yeah, the question was, where do we see the beaver license going at the end of it? So our license starts in 2020 for 5 years. Where do we see it going? That's the answer. I honestly have no idea. Sitting here,
You know, someone in the room has an answer.
I don't even think the person in the room probably knows the answer. But the problem is, we're sitting here as a licensee, as a landowner, and arguably you're sitting here as stakeholders in the local catchment. You're probably just as interested as we are, but we don't know is the truth. We would love for that 5 years to end and we can say, fantastic, they've done their job in the enclosure, let's let them go on to a bigger landscape scale. But the minute that's proving that it won't happen, and if you did go for a bigger catchment-based release, as far as my understanding goes, there's going to be a lot of loopholes you would have to jump through, and maybe even getting into compensation for unintended impacts, if you like to say. So it's a very thing that's changing quite fluidly at the minute, but I wouldn't like to say where it's going to go in 5 years. In my opinion, what's going to happen is we'll keep our enclosure. We'll keep our animals there because it's a great study. We're getting so much data through with the help of University of Lancaster to actually see how the trial's going. So it's a great study to see them in a small location. And maybe in the longer term, if you ask me what my longer term ambition would be, is the enclosure can support up to a family of 6. And I would love to get to the stage where maybe that's a breeding stock that then we can put out into the wider environment and help with other releases in the UK. So maybe that's a more appropriate direction that it would take. But in 5 years' time, the fence won't be coming down, I can't believe.
There's a question in the corner over here.
I just wanted to ask if more farms and estates in the UK go down this route, do we become more reliant on imported food?
Yeah, so the question was, if more farms and estates do this, will we become more reliant on imported food? There is that risk, yeah. But arguably, and what I think has to be really clear, is we're very unproductive land here, where we are on the estate. Maybe not here is a bit of a generalization. And I think you can do this in these marginal areas and you can still produce a bit of food production off it. But in the areas where it's productive to farm, we should get on and farm it. We should farm that conventionally, because suddenly we've given the space to nature in different areas. But maybe those conventionally farmed areas are actually given corridors, but suddenly we're no longer ploughing up to the field edges. And I know so many fellow farmers down in the south, big arable boys, that they're suddenly increasing their hedgerows, they're increasing their field margins because they're having to actually make the farm sustainable through public money again. So I think there is that risk, but I don't think we're going to ever reach that risk with what we're doing. The scale of what we're doing and the land that we were producing wasn't enough to actually argue that we're going to run out of food in the UK. At one stage, we were selling all of our lambs live weight to France, so all of our food went to France anyway. But of course, it has to be considered. But in my opinion, and some of you will probably shake your heads at this stage, I don't think our landscape where we are is there for food. And that is a very bold thing to say. But we've got to the stage now where maybe nature is more important. And someone talked to me recently, and they said, you don't get nature without food. But more importantly, you don't get food without nature. And I think that's what we've suddenly got to change in our mindset. You can't just think food, because suddenly food will stop. The soils will stop producing food if we don't just start looking at our farming system a bit more sustainably.
Let's take another 3 questions. I know there's one on Zoom at least.
Do you anticipate opening up nature safaris and wildlife walks like in NEP?
Yeah, so maybe everyone heard, I'll just repeat it. So the question was, do we anticipate doing tourism, wildlife walks and safaris like NEP? We'd be lying if we said we're not. We've got the potential to do it. But at the minute, I don't believe we have. maybe some of you in the room would be interested to come, but all you're really coming on now is a farm tour. And that isn't really going to generate a massive income and also visitors. But what Nepa's got the beauty of is amazing species coming back, from turtle doves to purple emperors to white storks nesting in the trees. So maybe when we get to the stage of being truly wild and truly restored landscape, then we can look at it. But I think at this stage, we really are wanting to give nature that space, step back and allow nature to come back into it. And then maybe we could explore that avenue. So in the immediate future, no, but there's no denying it is a possibility further down the line.
Excuse me, there's another one.
One more. Any plans to reintroduce pine martins?
So the question was reintroduce pine martins, or any plans for it? There aren't really. Pine martins are so close. There's reports seeing them in Greystoke. So the argument with reintroducing a pine martin is it's not needed. If we create the habitat, they'll just come. They'll come naturally. So I believe that's probably the right way. Just let them naturally come into our ecosystem, and that will probably be a better way for our own ecosystem to adapt. So the benefit of pine martins, probably even better for us, is the loss of grey squirrels. So suddenly they actually start predating on grey squirrels. They don't really target reds because of the smallness of the reds. The reds are a bit more agile and can get away. So there's benefits to we could actually see a reduction in grey squirrels. But we won't be doing an active reintroduction of them, but we'll hope that they will come with our environment that we're creating.
Richard.
You explained fantastically what you're doing with regenerative farming in the rewilding area, and how important it is to improve the soil. I'm just wondering if you're finding ways of improving the soil within the areas that you're proposing and still conventional farming.
Yeah, so the question was, are we, I'll try and say it again correctly, are we managing to find ways to improve our soils in the outer skirts of the estate and the conventionally farmed areas? The answer is we're always trying, but the other answer is it's our land, but it's tenanted land. At the end of the day, the person that has control over it is the tenant. We can offer as much advice and help with it as well, but they're probably better at managing that land than we could ever achieve. What we are hoping is that the way we're managing our own in-house farm, our regenerative dairy farm that is a productive ground, is that we can demonstrate that we can actually start to farm it in a different way, and others incorporate the ideas from it. So people come and visit and they say, oh, actually, that's really interesting. I'm going to take some of that home and use it, that method. And that's how we hope we'll maybe see a change. But we're not directly saying that this is the only way, because there's no golden ticket in this. And I think that's what we're quite aware of. We go into the very much unknown. Some of the stuff that we do, we have no idea what's going to happen. But that's the beauty of it. That's the excitement. The excitement is actually sitting back and saying, whoa, I didn't realize that was going to happen. Where did that thing come from? And that's kind of where we're going. So we're not actively pursuing saying this is the only way. We're always looking for new techniques. And suddenly some of our tenants are saying, wow, maybe we should look at this way. We've got some people are growing different cover crops, growing sainfoin, which is really actually quite beneficial to our bees, but then suddenly they're seeing it produce higher milk qualities in their dairy cows. So there's a bit of a knock-on effect. But no, there's no sort of direct influence there.
I think there's one last question. Two. So the man.
I assume you're in the scheme where you're getting paid for this. Could you tell us A, how much you get paid, and B, at the end of the scheme, how long the scheme is, and what happens at the end of the scheme when the enthusiasm's waned?
The question is about our schemes, about the sort of financial security of it, how long they go on for, and what happens afterwards. To answer it in the reverse, the enthusiasm won't stop because we're young and stupid. So we've got such a young team that are so in belief and so joined up thinking at the minute that I personally don't believe it will end.
Yeah, but what about, if the money?
Yeah.
If the money isn't there, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
There's the money brings the enthusiasm.
Yeah, completely. What directs farmers? It's normally cash. Our schemes are 10 years minimum. Some of them are 15. Our Making Space of Water is 20 years. We just signed up for a tree scheme that's 30 years. So some of them are quite long term, probably even outlasting me. but they are there. And I think that's what's important, is at the minute, there's a lot of talk about what's happening. Should we wait for elms? Should we wait for the SFI? But at the minute, these schemes are on offer, and it is good. In terms of, Tim said, I never mentioned what our bank balance is like these days, and we suddenly went into the green once we changed farming, and that is through government subsidies on a high proportion of it. What it's building is sustainability. So at the end of the 10 years, what happens if there's no more scheme? Is quite a big question there. Well, at the end of the 10 years, suddenly what are our costs? That's quite an interesting one. What are our actual costs? Well, it's pretty small, really. Our labour is diversified. Suddenly, our labour into our cattle is pretty minimal. We check them once, and then when they're actually calving twice a day. So that's pretty small. We don't have any feed costs. Our vet and med's tiny. We don't use any worm, so we only do it on if we need it to try and reduce our ivermectins. When we use a worm, we try and find a worm without ivermectins in to keep our dung beetles and all of our sores coming up through that. So I'd like to see if we imagine that the subsidies ended, I would like to see that we could probably just about sustain ourselves. I'm not saying we could be profitable. I would like to say we could sustain ourselves because we've reduced our overheads and our costs so much. In terms of what we actually make from the schemes, I'm not going to answer because I don't want to. I'm not going to answer because I don't have an accurate figure. This changes all the time. But what I would say is it's helped profitability on the farm. If you are really interested, I could send you an email after, but I'm not going to give a figure when I can't give it accurately.
So our last question.
It's slightly related, but I'm interested in how important your scale is in making it possible what to do. Like most of the farms around here are maybe 1 or 2 or 300 acres. And if there are farmers who may be interested in doing this, do you think there are things you've learned that are applicable and how the public payments work on that?
Yeah, so the question was about scale. Can farmers do it on any scale? Is the summary of the question, really. And there's certainly a couple of farmers that I know in this room that are doing it on a much smaller scale than we are. And they're arguably doing it maybe even better. Their cows are probably finished better than us. Their land has maybe even got more richer herbal layers than us. So I truly believe you can do it on any scale. I think you can, whether you're a 200-acre farm, whether you're a 6,000-acre farm, I think you can do it. But you have to realize that everyone's going to do it differently. Maybe the places where they're doing it on the smaller scale, they're managing to get what we're seeing in our regeneration, but they're managing it through intensive stock grazing in certain times of year, or moving stock on at different times of year. But I think the more exciting thing is suddenly with this, it creates joint up thinking. Suddenly we're starting to talk to our neighbours. Neighbours are talking to their neighbours, and then it leads on to a much bigger partnership. So suddenly, imagine if you were a 300-acre farm and you wanted to do landscape scale. Well, you could do it. You can do quite a big scale. 300 acres is pretty big, but really you can't see a whole landscape there. But suddenly, if your next door neighbour's doing it, and there's loads of cluster groups locally and even further afield that are doing this. And more exciting, we've just joined into a thing called the Endangered Landscape Partnership, which is 33,000 hectares, and that's much bigger than what we are in-house. But that incorporates all those farms that you're just talking about. And suddenly they can picture this on a landscape scale. They could join into a scheme, but maybe they only get a corner of their field planted with trees or some wildflower meadows stored in just 10 acres of their 200-acre farm. But they're part of a much bigger environment that they can be joined into. And that's suddenly quite an exciting world when we can have joint up thinking. And I think that's what I'm quite keen to promote, is in this world of food production, or whether it's into the environment, we're not going to do it as just one person. We're never going to just achieve it just doing it ourselves. Anyway, we're going to restore something like a stork or any of the birds or even a sturgeon is if the whole area does it. We can't just do it by ourselves, because 6,000 acres or 4 miles of river is nothing to these animals. A beaver can easily travel 10 miles in a night. A white stork flies to Africa. So we have to start thinking that it's not us and them. We've all got to do this as one. And whether it's some places are just doing a tiny bit, that's fine. Some places are doing loads of it. Some places might be doing none of it. But that mosaic, that woolliness that creates throughout the whole of the UK is where we'll start to see massive impacts on nature, positive impacts on nature. So I think the scale thing is a mindset, and I think it's something we can change if we all collaborate.
So on that note, I think we'd like to thank you very much. Three things in our path to Gordon. Firstly, as you know, we try to raise money at these events. We raised last year about £2,000, which 1,000 went into the internal resources of Country all the way to finance things like the Heritage Bank I mentioned before, but also £1,000 into charities in this area. Who would you like to nominate?
We always nominate to the Penrith Red Squirrels as well. Any talks that we do goes to them.
So before you go, if you have the time, this is our little sheet that allows you to these meetings. If you like to make any contribution, take it everyone. We also have books. This is the Ullswater Walking Companion, Ullswater Guide. We luckily get 50p per copy sold from David Feldman's outfit called Inspiring Lakeland. And then there are leaflets so you can have access to the Heritage Bank book market if you want one, the local map issued by the Ullswater Association, and our Heritage Trail. Feel free to pick those up. Our next talk is going to be on the 2nd of March. It'll take place in Watermillock, Village Hall. We'll have our AGM before that at 6 o'clock. You're very, very welcome. Zoomers as well. I think we'll have to try and see whether we can get the Zoomers on as well. AGM is talking about who we are, what we're doing, what we're trying to do, our vision, number of further events. And Gordon here is going to give a talk after the AGM on an initiative that he is very much involved in at the moment, which is creating a symbiotic link between art and landscape in Ullswater. Maybe he'll say a few words on that after he's given his little vote of thanks for Jim.
Thank you very much, Jim. I think we'll all agree whether you agree with what Lowther are doing or you don't. And I know we have both camps in the audience. Hang on, let me just go on. Then that was a very powerful talk. Certainly, I mean, I was brought up in the post-war ammonium nitrate, almost industrial farming industry, just the road of Watermillock. Nature never had a voice. And I think it's only right that nature does have a voice. How much of a voice you give it is ultimately down to yourself, because no one is forcing you. I know there's many people in here tonight are wishing Lowther and wishing what Jim and his team are doing absolute success. And there's others in the audience shaking their heads saying it will never work, it will never pay. And for those of you who want to do that, that's fine, because if it fails, it's on Lowther. Simply, and that's kind of all I wanted to say on that. Wish you every success, but for those of you who carry on doing it I won't say the old-fashioned way, the traditional way, in a way, the tradition is the old-fashioned way, going way back, which brings me on to my talk. So, first of all, after such a good and powerful talk, I'm the one that has to follow it. That's a hard act to follow, Jim. So thank you very much for that. Anyway, we're going back. We're going way back in time. Back to 1740 and before, and we have some great headliners in this talk. So we have the likes of J.M.W. Turner. We have the father of Australian landscape painting. How does that work? Well, come and find out. That's John Glover. And we're moving through the history of art through the landscape of Ullswater. So we're going all the way from 1740 through to the modern day, and some of the painters and artists, some of whom are in this room again this evening, and some of whom represent the Evan Network, the Eden Valley Artistic Network. So that's a brief talk. I think we're actually in Glen Riding, Tim.
Oh, sorry.
So we were just in case I'm wrong or Tim wrong, double check when the announcement comes out. I'm pretty sure we're in Glen Riding. And I hope to see you all there. And one last thing, just another big thank you for Jim and the talk and what they're doing at Lowther. Who knows if it's the right way or the wrong way? The great thing is we can all come here, listen to what the different views are, have the debate, and let's see what the future holds for all of us. So thank you very much.